Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure to welcome our last agorist of this year's Aboagora 2024. So we have gone through almost 3 days. So thanks for all of you who have been here and for those of you who have come now to listen to our third agorist. So we have a guest from Sweden, a writer, Thella Johnson, who is also a journalist and a musician and author. She published her novel called Peace this year, and it got also translated in Finnish in spring. So it is quite appropriate to end these discussions on war and turmoil to a discussion on peace, and that will also bring us further to next year's topic and the planet Venus and the topic of peace. And Thella will be talking about when peace comes. So warmly welcome, Thella.
Thank you, Marit, and thank you, Aboagora. I'm honored to be here speaking on this topic. I'm gonna tell you something more about my background, what I do. Like Marit said, I'm a journalist. I'm a writer, an author, and also a musician and a composer and lyricist. My roots are in Finland and Sweden. My mother is a Finnish immigrant in Sweden. My father was born in Sweden, but he has a Finnish family, so his family are Swedish-speaking Finns originally from the city of Viipuri in Karelia, the part that was lost during the war. And I grew up in Sweden with this Finnish-Swedish family. I have one grandfather who fought in Finland's wars, in the Continuation War and the Lapland War, and was quite traumatized by that. I also have another grandfather, a Swedish grandfather, who was in Sweden, but he was fighting with the Norwegian resistance movement during the war. He was also active in the movement to assist Finland and was ready and willing to take up arms for Finland. So I have these two ancestors very much kind of involved in different ways in the Second World War. And after the war, my Swedish grandfather, he started publicly. He was an anti-fascist, but then he started to publicly say that Sweden should side with NATO against Stalin, which was quite unpopular in like at least the cultural life of Sweden at that time. He was an author also, and so I guess he was very much an anti-totalitarian, can say that. So he, in the end, never had to take up any arms, but he was writing all his life, so he had his pen was his weapon. So that about what was before me, but what has, of course, affected me. I have spent a great deal of my professional life, my working life, and also a great deal of my artistic exploration, focusing in different ways on conflict. It has just so happened. I have worked extensively covering the conflict and post-conflict of Northern Ireland. I have covered stories from the civil war in Sierra Leone and its connection to Finland, actually, because there was a youth football team 20 years ago, half of the boys ran away when they were here in Finland playing a major tournament. It was 1 year after the civil war had ended, and it became a big story in both countries, and it affected both countries quite much. In Finland, it not least affected Finnish football, because several of the guys who got residence permit here started playing for Finnish teams, and some also made it to England and other clubs in Europe. One of them was actually for many years the great pride of a local football club here in Turku. He was considered one of the best goalkeepers in Finland at that time. So, but that was just a small anecdote, but it perhaps shows that the topic of conflict and peace is also always, by nature, a story of migration, or many stories of migration. And so by nature, I think, my novel piece, which is Fred in Swedish, it was out last year, and it's just recently out in Finnish as Rauha, in a beautiful translation by Nichola. This book also contains a lot of stories of migration in different ways. I have been asked to read from the book, so I will do that just in a moment, and after that I will try and talk about a couple of things apart from the kind of main obvious thing to write about peace and trying to depict peacetime, like why write a peacetime novel? It's usually wartime novels, but I didn't want to do that, so I'm going to talk about that. But apart from that, I thought I'd say something about... Oops, let's wait that out. Okay. Yeah. So, I thought I'd talk about local shops. The importance of neighborhood corner shops and what role they can play in many situations and in the kind of coexistence of human beings in the world. I also hope I will have time to touch upon the privilege of beauty, the privilege to see it, to appreciate it, and having time and space for it. Yes, and also there was a question in, I think in the program presentation of this talk, there was a question, something like, is it possible to imagine a world where peace exists only in the past, as a part of history? And I will get back to that question, but I can already let you know that I can answer it. And I can also reveal that the answer is yes. I am myself a living proof of that. But I will come back to that towards the end. So I'm going to read from the book now. It is from the first chapter of the book, which incidentally also begins with a few lines from the Kalevala, the first runo of Kalevala, the first song, and that this English translation is by Nichola Smalley. We are still trying to find the right publisher for an English edition of the book, so just letting you know that this Kalevala excerpt is translated by Eino Friberg. In the space, sorry, I should read the Kalevala, I skipped it. Okay. Suddenly a storm wind blew. Out of the east an angry blast blew the water to a foam, heaving the rollers up high. I think the runo rhythm is not quite the same in English, but it's good anyway. In the space of a few seconds, that morning in the mouth of the Kokemäki River on the northern side of Pori, which until that point had been a vaguely optimistic late summer's day in late July 1945, indolent, mild, free from drama, developed into what would always be known as the day my maternal grandfather, Tapani Kansa, stepped on a dead roach in his walking shoe. He'd just climbed out of his rowing boat by the jetty in Forsvik in Kari, and then out of a pair of meter-long waders in order to change into his town clothes, hence the waiting shoes, a new pair of brown derbies paid for with his demob money and tucked into the grass under the quay. This happenstance, rather improbable human-fish encounter took place with no witness but the trees and the creepy crawlies in the ditches, and convinced the 22-year-old Tapani Kansa that he would be forced for the rest of his life to tolerate any kind of company that touched his skin, big fish or small, lovely or ugly. However, this unexpected landing onto this little critter was mostly just an accelerating factor. Tapani Kansa's transformation had begun the previous year, when he'd been involved in significantly larger landings than this one. He'd departed a ship and a cargo hold in Rauta harbor along with several thousand others, to cycle southwards towards a likely death. But his friendship with Yrjö Aaltonen, the photographer, had saved him. Aaltonen belonged to the Army's Information Division. He was involved in the production of books about Finland for the German public. They'd got to know each other during the invasion of Ladoga Karelia during the Continuation War. And now, landing in Tornio 3 years later, upon the bike saddle en route from Reuta harbor towards the bridge over the Kirkkopudas, with hunger, flu, exhaustion, fear, doomsday feelings in his body, Private Tapani Kansa managed to cycle fast, if only because of the cheerful mantra, Aaltonen's mantra, he was reciting to himself. Toe, heel, toe, heel, toe, heel, toe, heel. Yrjö Aaltonen, constantly on the hunt for subjects suited to the image of Finland, had developed a liking for Kansa's profile and poise, and for the way he walked in his boots. He set down his feet first. He set down his feet, toes first. Even when marching, he did this, more or less unnoticed, presumably because he wasn't the slightest bit aware of it himself. Toe, heel, toe, heel, toe, heel. Not until a fascinated Aaltonen pointed out this did he become aware that it was something not everybody did. Aaltonen was spellbound and began, when he wasn't taking photos, to write poetry about his subject. He creeps so delicate, toe, heel, like the lynx after his prey on the fell. The photographer saw in young Kansa the beautiful, gracious progress of a unified, proud nation, which he wanted to capture in a single body. He wanted to capture that body in every sense. But it started with photographs. Tapani Kansa as ein Finnischer Soldat, on skis, on bicycle, with a rifle, with one foot on a log, on his haunches in front of a dugout, over the springs, summers, autumns, and winters of 1941, 1942, and 1943, pamphlets and advertising leaflets were distributed to households in both large and small towns in Hitler's Germany, all illustrated with the same manly man. Tapani Kansa was undeniably ein gut aussehender Mann, but he wasn't blonde, not the Platonic Nordic archetype the makers of propaganda books would have gone for had they been the ones holding the camera. He wasn't even that fair. His skin was olive-colored, his cheekbones high, and his lips a dark shade of purple in the summer. Those heart-shaped lips. The photographer Yrjö Aaltonen was in love. He was also an artist. He would later offer an apology for all his war images, or at least nearly all of them, which had been a good hand for a conscript to be dealt and a meal ticket, but still anything but art. The springs, summers, autumns, and winters that provided the setting for Aaltonen and Private Kansa's successful collaboration featured a number of stolen moments of tenderness. Amongst all cruelty, all the high treason and machinations, all the human slaughter, there were moments when the Army Information Division camera was left hanging from a hook on the wall, while 2 sets of toes and other things too slotted into one another under a blanket. In the aftermath, it was hard to determine how the roach had died. Perhaps its throat had been cut when the shoehorn Tapani Kansa carried plunged like an axe into the back part of his shoe. Or maybe it was the setting down of his left heel that finally put it to death. When he first felt the cold wetness crunch and squelch in his shoe, he let out a shrill "Hurr!" and started flailing his leg wildly. But his battle reflexes were such that when the shoe didn't immediately release his foot, he simply gathered the essentials as quick as he could, shoehorn in boots in his left hand, bag of civvies in his right, and set off at pace towards the dense arch of alder that formed a portal between the little peninsula with its moorings and fishing facilities on one side and the agricultural world with its ditches and dirt tracks marked by inland-leading horse and wheel tracks on the others. He leapt up onto the bike and pedaled for his life, toe, heel, toe, heel, toe, heel. It wasn't until he'd gone 100 meters or so that he was able to process the absurdity of the situation. There was no front, no weapons, at least none that killed human beings. No bellowing commanding officers. He braked suddenly, threw the bike down, and tore off the shoe out of which slipped the fish, which lay in the grass motionless. It was small in size and shiny of scale, with pale red eyes that had not yet begun to glow with the angry red of the older roaches. In the unluckiest leap of its life, it had split the water's surface right by the shore, swinging over the edge of the jetty with the force of the universe behind it. Right in the place where a rotten board had been removed for repair. At the moment the laws of gravity had taken hold of the little fish, it had fallen through the gap where the board had been and there been captured by a derby shoe, rather than the bare earth. And before it had a chance to flop its way out, a foot and a shoehorn had put a stop to all onward journeys. The first flies were already gathering around the roach. Soon, several of them would be certain to accompany the fish into the red gullet of some seabird. All in all, the experience of the shoe invasion, the ludicrous scene that had been performed to no one but beasts and trees, and now the sight of flies on the shining silver flank of what had until recently been a living creature, shook my grandfather to the core. He was struck for a few moments by a series of key insights into the short distance between life and death, the fragility of the flesh, the brevity of life. Full of thoughts about leaps of fate and lost chances, he mounted his bicycle and pedaled off at the same brisk pace. One left sock poorer, his foot sticking to a blood-soaked leather insole, he rode into town. Thank you. So that's how the story of Elina Kansa's grandfather, Tapani Kansa, begins. And I think all Finns in here are a bit confused now because they are thinking, who, Tapani Kansa? Who is she talking about? Because you are very familiar with the iconic singer Tapani Kansa, which in this novel has the kind of suffix Tapani Kansa, the young, because this grandfather is Tapani Kansa the elder, born some 20 years before the singer or so. But the author could not resist giving the grandfather in this book that name. And also there's another reason, the two Tapani's. Actually, later on in the novel, they cross paths, you could say, in a kind of strange way. And it is a part of one kind of stream in this story that contains a lot of popular culture, which I wanted to include in the book. So it's also an homage to Tapani Kansa, the great singer, the great Iskelmä singer, and others that have given the past decades the shape of pop music. So Tapani Kansa the Elder, the grandfather of the book's narrator, Elina, you could say that he is, I said I would talk about beauty, and he is someone who, he believes in beauty, like Björk would have said, he's Venus as a boy. He wants to be a free soul, but he's kind of like that fish caught in his shoe. You can say he is himself caught in a time where there's a lot of kind of programming going on. He's been forced to fight as a very young man in a war, in 2 wars, and then when the war is over, the nation builders, the kind of city planners, local politicians, the corporate heads of sales and imports, they want to make use of him because he's an engineer, but he's also very good at drawing and very passionate about it. But they can't really appreciate him for all that he is, and this frustrates him. He becomes, you could say, this kind of man that struggles to feel at home in the time where he exists, and it's a big part for me, I think, in wanting to write about Finland's modern history. Is this the kind of phenomenon that, I mean, it's not unique to Finland, but it's the Finland I have grown up as. It's been part of me for my whole life, kind of nation that first, when it's attacked, becomes this defense machine, this war machine for some years, much like Ukraine right now, you could say. And then when the war is over, it becomes a kind of peace machine, because now we need to build our country back from the ruins. We need to build something, a new nation. We have to build prosperity. We have to build resilience. And Tapani Kansa, although he has, his last name indicates that he is a part of a nation and a people. Kansa is that in Finnish. He's not really comfortable in being a brick in this project. He wants to be free. He wants to set his thoughts free, and it's difficult in a time like that, I imagine, because I'm the 3rd generation. So that always, of course, has also done something with my perspective. It was actually very, how is you say it in English? Pysäyttävä. It was like, it made something that made me think a lot. Was something that happened to me when I was in the middle of writing this novel, and I mean it's fiction. It's a fairy tale, basically, this book. But of course, there's a lot of my family's experiences in it, and I was visiting my great aunt, my real grandfather's sister. My grandfather had died many years before that. I was visiting her in Pori, where we have a small place in the forest, and she brought out this diploma that my grandfather had been given, as all veterans that had survived the war, by Mannerheim, the Marshal Mannerheim, the head of the army, and it said, "Thank you for your noble, brave service." And when I looked at that, because I think I was in the middle of processing this this kind of dilemma, how do you live as a free person? When there's peace, you should be able to live freely and in safety, but still you feel like something is expected from you, some kind of national loyalty that you're not really not really understand. This was my thoughts, and I said to my great aunt, to my grandfather's sister, that I wonder what they made of this piece of paper. Was it so nice to get that? You have been through all these terrible experiences. You're probably traumatized, maybe injured from the war, and then you get this like, thank you for going out there and receiving all this this pain and suffering for your nation. And I was kind of thought of it as a bit silly almost. And my great aunt said very seriously, she was like, she looked at me like she didn't understand my question at all, and she said, just, I think he was really proud to have that. I think it made him really proud. And that made me think about, I think it made me realize, first of all, that I'm a writer, so I kind of demand space for my own thoughts on the matter, and think that I have something to offer, maybe. But it also made me a bit humble. It made me think that, yes, I was not there. And I think this kind of inner conflict has been very present, at least for me, writing this book. But then I will skip from the Finland history in the 40s to present time, because the idea to write this peacetime novel, I think it started creeping on me very kind of intuitively. It wasn't something I understood immediately, but I think there was some kind of seed that started to grow around the spring of 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed the Crimean Peninsula. I was already here in Finland at that time working as a correspondent and also covering the Baltic countries. So I was very much into what was happening, and I also noticed that in Sweden people weren't really there yet. The understanding of what was happening was quite different. So something began, and I think during the years that followed, I realized slowly that as someone who has grown up in the Nordic countries in the 90s and in the 80s maybe, and so after that, that my life as I had known it was actually coming to an end. Something was changing. This, for example, world famous policy of non-alignment that has been, like the neutrality that has made both Finland and Sweden famous, it was sure to be ending soon. You could feel that. And I thought this must mean something. It must be like a big change. So that made me feel a bit of urgency and kind of hurry to get this time, the time that I have grown up in, on paper, and at the same time, sort of the time that I was born into, the time my parents grew up in, because there was the feeling that in a quite near future we could probably be saying that after the Second World War there existed a period of peace, some decades, and that it could be somehow framed now. You could see that. So I wanted to kind of dive into what happened during these years in the corner of the world where we live. These years, these decades of peacetime and democracy. What have people been up to? What have we been doing with our lives? What happened to our dreams? What became, and what have we done with the peace that we've had? So there was a kind of a question at the very core of this writing project. From that day when the grandfather Tapani Kansa stepped out of his rowing boat and stepped on this fish in his shoe, and 70 years on from that, what has been going on? And then there were some events that really kicked off this project. Some just few moments that happened, and it was the autumn of 2015 in Lapland in northern Finland by the border of Sweden. That made me I was there working as a journalist for Swedish radio, and you remember it was the time when the world and Europe were facing a new wave of mass migration, I think at some point there were like over 1 million people only from Syria who had to become refugees and were stuck in the neighboring countries. And there were some 100,000 that made it to Europe and some thousands to Finland. It was a lot of Iraqi that had heard from people where they lived that they would be welcomed in Finland. And this wasn't only a false rumor, it was actually some truth to it at the time, because Finland was interpreting the UN conventions in a bit of a different way than many other European countries, and had a praxis for, not least for the city of Baghdad, that the authorities in Finland deemed that it was at the time such a dangerous place to live that you would definitely have the right to an asylum process in Finland, and you would be kind of classed as having the right of international protection. And Finland was quite unique for a short time in this. So those that came, they came for that reason, and this policy of course changed rapidly after some time, because the EU harmonized its policies. But I was in Tornio by the border of Sweden and Finland, and in Kemi, small places in Lapland, during that autumn. I was meeting the refugees, the families that just arrived with buses from Sweden, and I was meeting Red Cross workers that had built like temporary centers because the regular ones were full. I also met civil servants from migration authorities. I also talked with these anti-immigration, anti-refugee protesters that were gathering in different cities and also there by the border. And those were moments, I think, in the modern, very modern history of Finland and Sweden and Europe, that it will be interesting what we will make of them in some time. But when I was there in Lapland, I started to feel like time was kind of starting to become cyclical, that it went full closure in some strange way, and the past and the present started existing at the same time. It was a very strong emotion, and it was overwhelming for me because I saw all this that was happening. It was quite a lot of turmoil, actually. It was like a turbulent atmosphere at that time. And then I had in the back of my mind this family history of my own with my own grandfather that had been, he was posted during the Lapland War in to guard the bridges of the Kemi River, where that the Germans were blowing up when they were fleeing. And this is small communities, like small towns, small places, and in the 40s, during the war, people were fleeing and crossing that border in the other direction. They were coming into Sweden. So I got kind of stuck in thoughts about this, and that is where someone asked me once, like, where did the novel piece, where did it begin? And I would say it began there, because I realized that I must try to make a big story out of this whole kind of context. It's not something that will let itself be explained in a news report, in a news broadcast. And it was like a couple of different images. I'm talking about this because it's really, I think it's something that also could be quickly forgotten, because we are fed the news all the time, and it's different conflicts, different politics. But what happened up there, it was, I think it was telling something about our time. I saw in these anti-immigrant protests, suddenly one day a placard, they held these placards where said, close the borders, things like that, go home. But then one day someone held up a placard with the symbol of the Lapua movement. It's the kind of radical, right-wing militant movement from Finland during Civil War times, and after that was inspired by Mussolini and banned after they tried to commit a coup d'etat in Finland. And suddenly this symbol, the bear and the fighter with a knife, is appearing in this random like anti-refugee demonstration in the millennium, like in 2015, so many decades later. And I started seeing these placards also in Helsinki, and that's one reason that I started to think that the past is kind of blowing up now in the present. And at the same time, I was meeting these families from Iraq that were arriving, and there was one girl, one 18-year-old girl from Baghdad that I met, a student of the technical college in Baghdad, who'd come to Finland. She was there with her whole family. There had been threats of kidnappings at the college, and cases of kidnappings, so the family feared for their children's lives. And they had gotten to Tornio, and she was sitting on her bunk bed in this barrack that was the refugee center. And she was I had just been out meeting these protesters, and she was just so happy and so kind of peaceful, sitting there on her bed, eating a sandwich and saying, I'm so glad that we are here because I know about this place. This is the end of the earth. That's what she said. This is close to the Arctic Circle. This is so far that I can get from my hometown and the violence there. And these families they had no idea about what the Lapua movement sign would like symbolize at all. They had no idea about the violent history of Finland because they arrive in this completely modern, democratic, prosperous country, and she's just seeing that and saying, we are here now, and this is the end of the earth, and this must be a peaceful place. So we will find peace here. So I was kind of stuck with these two, the absurdity of these two images, and that made it compelled me to begin this project. So I was writing the book kind of after that. It became the fuel for this project. And I understood that I needed a kind of playful, because I wanted to, how should I say this? I wanted to, like the history of Finland and the Nordic countries, it's been part of me for my whole life. But I felt that it was maybe time for me to also become a part of it and make my own take of this history. I felt that maybe I can contribute something to the writing of this history. So that was when I saw that this could become a quite big project, and that I needed a narrator, a voice to tell all these stories and these tales from the end of the earth in a kind of playful way, because I wanted it to be obvious also that this is a project that wants to discuss the time that we live in and the time that has just passed. So I had started, like I'd been writing for a year or so, trying to write just a story of this Chief Inspector Lahtela, who is still in the book. He's quite kind of a listening character, you could say, and this very rational guy who is he's the head of the migration service in the north of Finland, and he's ends up in this little local shop where Elina Kansa, the narrator and the kind of central figure of the book, lives and works together with her stepfather, Bodhi. So this is the setting, and this is where I get to this local shop I promised to talk about. Elina Kansa stepped forward because I felt that this man, Lahtela, this civil servant of many years, he needed to be in the book as this firm and kind of safe person that maybe the reader could agree with and lean on, or maybe sometimes get angry at, but he would have to be this kind of stable person that Elina could have her arguments with. So the stories of peace are told from the back room of a small local shop and bakery in the city, in the outskirts of the city of Kemi in Lapland. A small family business, very humble, and it makes up the stage for the frame story of this book, and is told in the present time, and it's kind of a saga or a legend. As I said, I wanted to kind of have a new sort of big story about our part of the world. But it wasn't until I was from the beginning, this shop was there. I knew that this is the place where the stories are told. But it wasn't until I finished the book that I realized that this was something. I had built this fictive shop in Kemi on something that I have actually experienced myself in my life. I have had this kind of original shop, and I will tell you about it. How much time do we have? Just so. Great. So, there will be time for discussion, and if we run out, there's always too little time. It's always the case. And if we run out of time, I will be there in the shop afterwards, and we can continue the conversation. But I will tell you about my shop and why I think it's such a great thing. This kind of tradition. It was a shop in central Stockholm where I grew up with my mother as a teenager. If you have been to Stockholm, you know Sveavägen is a really big, noisy kind of main street in the northern part of the city. Right at the city center, there's only offices and parking garages and department stores and things like that. But the further north you move on the street, there are residential buildings, old houses. There are a lot of like small flats, and I lived in one of those. They are often, then at least they were, now I think they're renovated to their teeth, but then they were often like semi-modern. You didn't have showers in the apartments. You had to go shower in the basement. There were like heaters for water and that kind of stuff. And the life on the street was, ever-changing. Businesses came and went, and people. But this little shop, right next to the building's front door, was always there. And when I was little, there was one owner, but he turned it over to these two guys, Ilhan and Joseph, two Assyrians from this neighboring city of Södertälje, south of Stockholm, who were commuting these 70 kilometers or so every day. It was open 6 days a week, late in the evenings, and then they went home to their families for the night. But they spent a great deal of their lives in that shop, a candy shop and a tobacco store. And what they were not just salespeople with a business. They were, of course, they sold candy and cigarettes, what the kids wanted, but they were also, they were quite young at the time, in their early 20s maybe, and they were friends who would keep you there and talk to you and ask you about how you were doing, ask you about school, about friends, about what was going on in the neighborhood. And people were meeting there and staying and talking. And in the same kind of way that the people are doing in the novel piece, even if it's very far away from that original shop, but they were actually also playing the role as a refuge for people when there were conflicts between youth gangs in the neighborhood and in the town, they would help those that people were after. I had a friend who once was chased by a group of people down the street, and she actually fled into that shop, and they hid her behind the counter in the back room. And I think a week later, the same thing happened to me. And then when I was like 14 or 15, you had this kind of work training in school. You have a few weeks where you get to try a job. So they let me work there, and they were always just looking after people, and they didn't even live there. It was the street, the kids of the street where they worked. But they became sort of guardian angels. So, I mean, why am I bringing this up when I'm talking about peacetime and writing about peacetime? It's because I think that, like, places like that, and that shop in particular, of course, for me, but I think you all probably have some memory of something like that. Maybe it wasn't a shop, but maybe it was a teacher or something. But I have always, since I lived there and got to know Ilan and Josef, this book is dedicated to them, actually, and the shop is still in the same place in Stockholm, and Ilan is still running it, actually. Since I got to know them very early in my life, I have always connected, I think, a sort of active street life, active social street life with what I would think of as civilization, like a scene, a stage, a miniature stage for a whole society, I guess, where people meet daily. It's in this everyday life, and there are conflicts. I remember there were complaints about how the shop in my neighborhood was displaying, like they had this ice cream counter in the summers, and there were old ladies that would say that they were ruining the street and taking up too much space, and in between the lines there could be some kind of racist comments because they were immigrants, and they would just stand up for themselves and call the old ladies out. And there was like a conflict resolution on a daily basis, and this in a time of course, of peace and democracy. And it was like the center of Stockholm, not an over-representation of social problems, not like that kind of heavy burdens on the society, just kind of functioning everyday life. And it just, I think, it's difficult to know how, but I think these kind of experiences, they do something, they count for something. And if you have built them up during peacetime, then that's how they can also survive during the worst of times, I think, and just because we know even during war, during like great oppression, dictatorships, there are these kind of pockets of humanity and solidarity between people that are not necessarily from the same kind of family or tribe or group or area in a city. It just exists because people do not want. Maybe people cannot avoid war, but they do not want it. They are trying to avoid it. And in the novel that I wrote is the narrator Elina Kansa's stepfather, Bodhi Adnan, who is playing that role of the one that is always choosing to have this kind of attitude. He wants to preserve this life in his neighborhood, and he wants to continue the conversation with strangers and the people, even though it's uncomfortable or even dangerous at times. He's subject to some threats at some point, for example, and he's the one that I like to say like lifts or heightens his gaze. And I think that's also something that you can maybe only, like a big number of people can only afford that during time of peace. And through that character, Bodhi Adnan, I let myself kind of examine how this attitude to life and towards other people and this kind of heightened gaze, how that attitude is constantly put to a test. It's quite difficult to maintain that attitude in society today. But also, what other way is there if we want to coexist as humans? It is the only option, but it seems very difficult to actually maintain. So I think I'm going to stop talking soon and let there be room for questions or discussion. But there was the question in the beginning, this kind of, is it possible, can we imagine a world where war exists only in past tense? And I would say yes, because as I've already kind of touched on, it actually happened to me. I am one of those who have realized quite recently, when the world was changing and the war came that much closer to me and my own family, that something had changed also in me. Suddenly I hadn't known this before, but suddenly I knew that I have actually been thinking for my whole life. I am one of those who have imagined that war for me exists only in the past. It's a part of history. I have thought that I will never be in a war zone. And I mean, it's just something that I think when you are struck by this insight, it's kind of sad, of course, and you could be called maybe naive or something, but it just shows that if you have grown up in certain circumstances, it is possible to imagine that for a long time even, and if that is possible, I think maybe that has some value too, that could be somehow put to use. This is my thinking anyway. Many of my generation who have been born and grown up in this part of the world, we have had the privilege to grow up not fearing war. It's just one little anecdote from my working life as a journalist that has to do with this. It was a lady that quit her job in the Swedish broadcasting company, in Sveriges Radio. She had long been the boss of the Finnish minority language edition of the Swedish radio news, and she was retiring, and there was this kind of farewell party for her, and so we had a conversation, and I was talking to her, asking her, what are you going to do now? Are you gonna grow a garden, stuff like that? And she said, I'm going to give myself time to think about something that has bothered me for so many years. And this woman was, she's my mother's generation, maybe a bit older, but she came as a migrant from Finland to Sweden during the 70s, and as a part of that group, she's lived for several decades in Sweden, and she said, I'm gonna give myself time to think about what it does to a people to live in peace for over 200 years, like Sweden, because it must have done something with the Swedes, and I can't really put my finger on what it is. And I think I was so surprised by the turn of our conversation, and it also turned the question on me somehow. I suddenly felt, often I feel very Finnish in Sweden, because I'm from a Finnish family and have Finnish traditions and stuff, but suddenly I felt very Swedish, and I was thinking, is she talking about me? Is there something about us that is different because of this difference? So she kind of also is to thank for this book, because she planted that question in me, like, what is that experience to having not experienced war for such a long time? I mean, it's already a long time, even here in Finland now, it's 70 years plus. And I think that also has done something. And what I think it may have done is kind of allowed for more of these heightened, lifted gazes, more space for conversation, maybe a sort of exhale, maybe a breath, if you know what I'm saying. Like, imagine a whole country kind of exhaling, just like for several decades, centuries even. Then, of course, I mean, this is, when I say this, I can often get people coming at me saying Sweden, because this is something, I don't know if you have heard it, but in Sweden, in some circles, especially like those that are very interested perhaps in military things, they have started to say that Sweden is a country with a peace injury. And it's, I mean, of course, it's a play with words, because we know what a war injury is, we know what war trauma is, and then you change the word war and replace it with peace, as if you could have been kind of traumatized or injured by having this long peace. And I personally, I don't like this, because I think there is a kind of insidious playing with language going on, because I mean, I work with language and words, and I think words mean something. So when you say that, peace injury, you mean something by it, and what is it that you mean? And I mean, I think we all understand maybe what the point is. Like, you could say that, yes, maybe have we become naive from not having war on our own turf for so long? Have we become like blinded so that we don't understand cyber threats, for example? We don't understand that we need to boost our defense spendings, but I find it so hard to accept that a life that long for a country. I mean, then of course Sweden, I mean, all states are pragmatic in their international relations. Sweden has avoided war by, for example, allowing transports of iron through its territory. It has exported a lot of weapons, and actually there's this very weekend there is a very similar kind of seminar going on, like Aboagora in Sweden, in the region of Bergslagen, where there is an old mine, Ställbergs gruva, that is today a cultural center ran by a group of artists, and they have kind of art science program there this weekend, where they talk about, they have scholars brought in to talk about the history of the mine, which was actually during the war a part of the arms industry. However, what I'm saying is that of course there are all these discussions about why has Sweden managed to avoid war for so long, and how, but the fact is that it has been so, and I think now when we look at the wars in the world and those that are also close to us, we should try and remember and make use of that gift of peace that we have been given, and kind of grab these little particles of gold dust. The author Kerstin Ekman, the Swedish author, she talked about this like that Sweden, there is a gold reserve of humanism in Sweden. She was saying this as in protest to a kind of hardened, more aggressive public discussion on refugees back then in 2015. But I think she was tapping into this long history where people haven't been forced to deal with war close upon their own family, there's a song from this very iconic Finnish punk rocker Pelle Miljoona. I thought I would just finish off with a quote from his song Rauhan aika, because that is also present in the final part of Peace. And I think it's so sad, but it's also so beautiful. In Finnish it goes like this, the chorus, Ystäväni, ootko tajunnut lainkaan, olet saanut elää rauhan aikaan. And it's a song, it's in English, it's like, my friend, have you even realized you have gotten to live during a time of peace? And this song was released in 1990, and it addresses the fall of the Berlin Wall and talks about the stories about two friends walking around in the city, and the wall is coming down, and they sing this to one another. But I think it's so the question is so sad and beautiful. It's like, are we able, while we are living in peace, are we able to even know it and understand it and appreciate it? It's a good question, and sometimes depressing, but also I think compelling. It asks us to ask ourselves. So yeah, thank you.